Great. Or should I say Fáilte, which is welcome in Irish. We are so delighted to have Ambassador Fergal Mythen with us today. But before we begin, some thanks. It's always good to begin with gratitude. And of course, the Cultural Center, as always, with their great assistance. Certainly my department, Department of Global Studies and Geography. And for those I don't know, I'm Linda Longmire, a professor in that department. And of course, the main sponsor, Peace and Conflict Studies, this exciting new program that is also the sponsor of our study abroad program, first version of which was last year, called Paths to Peace in Northern Ireland. And we have, in fact, a batch of participants from last year who, in the process, I think, fell in love with Ireland and the area, and we'll also have some good questions for the ambassador. I know that this is, and of course, you know, so many departments. I also want to thank the Public Policy Program for their assistance, and as I mentioned before, certainly the Geography, Global Studies and Geography Program, my two colleagues who brought classes. Thank you, Professor Jensen. And again, I know we are in the midst of a difficult time where peace seems even more elusive in so many parts of the world. So I don't want to pretend we're not abundantly aware of the horrible deaths in Israel, the taking of hostages, and now the escalation of these conflicts with, I think it's almost 10,000 or over 10,000 civilians who have now been killed, as well as almost 4,000 innocent children. So, and Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine still goes on. So it is difficult to be optimistic often as we look around the world, as we look at the challenges of not only peacemaking and peace building and peace maintaining, but as always, as the great Irish poet Seamus Heaney reminded us, we have to try to make hope and history rhyme. We have to try to address these urgent problems that seem at the moment to be tearing our world apart. But again, I always go back, as some of my students know, to Gramsci, who talks about pessimism of the mind, but optimism of the will, that we have to face these realities realistically, courageously, but at the same time act with hope and vision and some kind of long-term optimism. So in that spirit, we again are especially grateful to have the visit of Ambassador Fergal Mythen, who has a long career in all of those tasks of peacemaking, peace building, peace maintaining. I won't go into his long biography too much because we're going to do this as a kind of interview and ask him some questions about, as he shares this vast experience with peace building throughout the world. He's been involved in peace building.
You know, we love quoting poetry, but one great line of Yeats spoke about great hatred, little room, little room for compromise, little room when you know the two sides are at each other's throats, as it were, and that's where you need the international perspective to really tilt the balance and get people into the room. So some strong learnings there. Fast forward to Bosnia. I went to Bosnia in 1996, 1997. At that stage, the Dayton Accord was only a few months in place, very, very tentative. Obviously, again, a decisive role by President Clinton and Richard Holbrooke to knock heads together. Sarajevo at that stage was just, emerging, blinking, as it were, out of the siege. The city was destroyed. You didn't walk on grass for fear of landmines. Yeah. So even though the conflict was over, the conflict still kept on going on. And very often there was reports of young children playing in abandoned playgrounds or abandoned churches, losing limbs through mines. So the physical echoes of conflict continues, but also the scars, the psychological echoes, the psychological damage of living in a siege for 3 or 4 years was very evident with the people we worked for and worked with. I was there for just under a year. There was initial hope. I mean, I must say there was, in Sarajevo, in those first few months, life was seeping back into the war-torn city. Little businesses were opening up, micro businesses. There was more cars on the road. There was a kind of almost a euphoria, but that faded very quickly as people came to terms with what they had lived through, as the immediate demands of just daily survival lifted. Then just the scars of what people went through, the loss, the damage, the psychological pain, and I think Bosnia has struggled even since then to find its way forward and to find a lasting peace without the kind of what an Irish peace process negotiator called about the ugly scaffolding of peace frameworks. In Dayton, there's a three-way institutional framework for sharing government, very clunky, very difficult, lots of checks and balances. Similarly in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement has lots of checks and balances and very clunky power sharing architecture that can be very difficult to maintain. And we see that elsewhere. So, peace building, peace maintenance, peace securing is really difficult. And sometimes the framework that's negotiated to get to peace, as happened with the Dayton Accord, as happened with the Good Friday Agreement, that can be a bit of a straitjacket then 20, 30 years on in terms of moving to a deeper, more self-sustaining phase of peace and reconciliation.
That's such a long process, isn't it? Because it's changing hearts and minds, not only agreements and institutions. Those are important. That scaffolding is important.
Yeah, it is important and necessary. Yeah,
transform the way people see each other, the way they work together. There's still scars in Bosnia, in Sarajevo. I remember some students here. Well, they've all graduated now, but in 2017 and 18. Took a group of students on the European Odyssey, and we spent time in Sarajevo. You can still see the bullet holes, and you can still feel the scars that Fergal is talking about. So, that's again why it's so important to move towards a deeper peace that is genuinely sustaining, not just postponing conflict. But
another learning I came from it was that actually conflict can arise in the most surprising places. I would speak to young Sarajevans, like they were better educated than I was, they were more well-travelled than I was, they were cosmopolitan citizens of Europe. In 1984, the Winter Olympics were held in Sarajevo. We saw all the signs of it. This was a very prosperous, integrated, dynamic young city, and conflict came to it. And I remember a Dutch colleague saying, it's all about the lack of education, and I said, that's completely wrong. Conflict can happen because of greater forces. You quoted Gramsci. I'll quote another communist speaking about, you may not be interested in war, but war may be interested in you. And that's what's happening in Kyiv is another example of a really wonderful, thriving city that is now, under siege. So we shouldn't make assumptions that war or conflict is something that happens in faraway places where there's lack of opportunity or lack of education. It can happen wherever. I spoke to many, many people in Northern Ireland over my 15, 20 years engagement, and I asked particularly the older people, like, did you imagine in 1967 that Northern Ireland would face 30 years of conflict? And no one did. No one did. They knew there were tensions, they knew there were issues, they knew there were problems. Many of them were involved in civil rights activism, but no one imagined that the situation would spiral out of control. Why it did, we can go into, we can look at moments when particular actions happened, particular atrocities that just fueled it, drove the conflict, when mistakes were made by government, sins of commission, sins of omission. But conflict happens for a reason. There's always reasons behind why it spirals out of control. But once it spirals out of control, it can be really difficult to get back into a place. So one of the issues we're working on at the UN now is how do we invest in peace, in conflict prevention before it happens, before it breaks down. Our Prime Minister, Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, who negotiated the Good Friday Agreement, always spoke about how much more costly it is to end war and to repair the damage to society, both physical and psychological and emotional and economic. And, hardly a red cent is put into conflict prevention. And I think there's a real lesson there for all of us.
So important, and again, ground up conflict resolution. You know, that this is why all the work of even still the Fund for Ireland and so many things, so many initiatives are so important, because to build cross-sectarian and kind of respectful multicultural society takes ground up work as well as
it really
as
does.
well as
It really does. And
initiatives.
the Good Friday Agreement, as an example, you know, yes, at the end it was the great and the good flying into Belfast. It was Tony Blair, it was Bertie Ahern, it was Bill Clinton on the phone, cajoling and harassing and encouraging in his inimitable way, and George Mitchell. But none of that would have been possible had there not been the grassroots work, community. You know, mothers of prisoners saying, "I don't want my son in jail anymore. I want this to end." Really, you know, ground up grassroots community activism. That the International Fund for Ireland supported. It can't be done without support and funding. But it was that pressure from the community that drove you know, the IRA, the UVF to you know, seek a path to peace. It was also, you know, pressure on the Irish government as the atrocities continued into 1993, 94, to work with the British government. This all takes pressure, but it's never just a top-down approach.
Right. One bottom-up approach has been, of course, with the Accord, but ongoing peace work and preliminary peace work on the part of women. And so many of the folks here, some of the students here, have seen this great film. Sydney, you had a question about gender, didn't you? About the role of women. Did you want to share that?
Yeah, I was wondering what
Could you speak a little louder?
Actually, you know what? I probably shouldn't have done that, because we need a mic.
I can hear you.
Do you
if
want to
want.
come
Yeah,
up here?
Yeah.
Here's a mic, because we're recording
go.
it.
Yeah.
So, Fergal.
Great. Okay. Yeah.
Sydney, do you want to bop over there?
Yeah.
Some people saw the wonderful film called Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs that we showed at the symposium, which is about the Women's Coalition and the great work they did building amongst women, cross-sectarian interests, the peace process.
Hi there. I went on the Paths to Peace trip, and I found the women and their grassroots movements particularly inspiring. Did you have any personal experiences with the Women's Coalition? And if so, what was that like?
Yeah, thank you very much. Cindy, is it?
Sydney.
Yeah. I know. I mean, I've been speaking here, and I'm assuming a level of knowledge about the Good Friday Agreement and the Dayton Accord and that, but I'm happy to, you know, answer any questions. The role of women is hugely important and can't be overstated. I worked very closely with Monica McWilliams and Jane Morris and various people in the Women's Coalition over many, many years, including up to most recently. But I worked with women across all the political parties and also at grassroots level. And I referred to, you know, the mothers just so worn down by, you know, their sons in prison, their sons dying, and also pushing back against a very, you know, look, it was a very masculine environment. Belfast, Derry, very masculine environments, and the conflict was very masculine. And there wasn't a strong role for women in the structures, political structures, or even, you know, other community structures, and that changed and developed. And in a sense, it was women who claimed their space and their voice, and, you know, really pushed for change. You had early examples, the peace people back in the 70s. That was two mothers who got the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize in the 1970s. One lost their children were knocked down by an IRA car that was crashed after it had been shot by the British Army. So it was just a cry for stop. It didn't happen, it didn't succeed, but women's voice and women's activism was very, very important at that community level, as I say, particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, driving the debate for a peace path and a peace process in their communities. And then we saw that demand for a voice at the table as of right in the peace negotiations. The Women's Coalition was started because many, many women felt they weren't represented in and weren't getting a voice in the other political parties, and they were elected to the Peace Negotiation Forum 1996, 97, 98 and played a really strong role. one really important contribution they made to the Good Friday Agreement itself, and I'm sure you may have heard this in that movie, but as the negotiations and the drafting was coming to a conclusion, it was the Women's Coalition who said there's nothing here about victims, there's nothing here about legacy of the past, there's nothing here that speaks to all those from right across the community who have lost loved ones, who have suffered so much over 30 years of conflict. And so the really inspiring and beautiful language, particularly in the preambular paragraphs of the Good Friday Agreement, stemmed from the activism of the Women's Coalition. I think it's really significant now that the current First Minister of Northern Ireland, or designate First Minister, is a woman. The last First Minister, Arlene Foster, was a woman. So we've seen women assume their roles as of right in the political process in Northern Ireland, but it didn't happen by accident. And I think one of the issues that we've really driven forward in the United Nations context is the role of women, peace and security. What does that mean? It means that when briefers are coming into the Security Council, there's a woman's perspective, particularly from the field. I mean, when we had the presidency of the Security Council in September 2001, we brought in 16 female briefers from Afghanistan, from Africa, from across the board, just to ensure that women's voices were heard directly in the Security Council. But also we've been pressing to ensure that, particularly in UN-led peace negotiations, that women are at the table, not outside. It's a really, really important perspective. It's a work in progress. It's not always successful, but it's hugely, hugely important. And thanks very much for that question. Yeah.
Fergal, your remark about the United States playing the role of honest broker as a crucial element of getting the agreement to happen was interesting to me, particularly because we're thinking about the two big conflicts we're facing today in Ukraine and in Palestine, Israel. It's pretty clear that the United States is not an honest broker in that case, that we've actually taken sides. So I was wondering if you'd comment on, are there moves to move us in the direction of taking the honest broker role in either of these two conflicts?
Yeah, that's a really challenging question. I'm going to be very, very careful because I'm a diplomat. I think firstly, every conflict is different, and therefore what worked for Northern Ireland isn't going to work, and the same template isn't going to work in other conflicts. US involvement in Ireland, Northern Ireland, was hugely important, not just because of US influence, power, but also the huge Irish American community here pushing politicians to get involved and play that really positive role. And I have to say, people like President Clinton and subsequent presidents and administrations and Congress played a really meaningful role in terms of building support right across the two communities and not being one-sided. In Bosnia, it played a very strong, important role, but also NATO played a very important role in a sense, pushing back territorial gains by certain groups that then have balanced the scales and allowed the negotiation to take place. So that was a very different model. But again, US involvement was hugely important in that and the role of Holbrooke, etc. In the Middle East, clearly the US has a particular position, and we all fully understand that. But we all know, and we look to the US as the one country that can have influence, particularly with Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that the US alone can carry or should carry that burden. And I specifically mentioned the Gulf countries. You look at Egypt and also Egypt and Jordan, and you look at the European Union. It can't be done alone. But a peace process absent US engagement is not going to get very far in the Middle East. Not going to get very far. So I think, I would encourage you all to listen to Secretary of State Blinken's comments today. He was in Paris for a humanitarian summit by President Macron. He laid down some very important markers. He was basically saying, no reoccupation of Gaza, no, movement of the Gazan population out of Gaza, any peace process revitalization, and any solution must be based on the Palestinian Authority, exercising its authority in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, two-state solution. So it was a very important intervention. And also, very important interventions by President Biden. At the very early stages, he said Hamas does not equal Palestine. Hamas does not equal Palestinians. These are very important interventions at certain moments. So the role of the US in the Middle East is going to look very different to what it was in Northern Ireland, but it's still indispensable. And you look back to the Oslo Accords in the early 1990s. The role of the Bush administration was very important in pushing the Israeli government, encouraging them to get into the negotiating space. So it's a tough burden. It's a tough burden for the US, and I know it's a burden that the US doesn't always want, but it's a really important role, and it's indispensable. And it's indispensable in many parts of the world, but it can look different in each case.
I wanted to just mention that in 2001, we had a big international peace conference here called 2001 A Peace Odyssey. Yeah. And we had Senator George Mitchell was here, along with actually David Trimble, and we invited John Hume, of course, but he wasn't able to be here. But in any case, again, this was just a few years after, the accord. And he said something very similar. It's very important to recognize the specificity of each conflict, and that, of course, hopefully there are things to be learned about peace building, whether or not it's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa at that period, or Northern Ireland Agreement, but also to acknowledge and recognize, first of all, the larger geopolitics change, as well as the specificity of each situation.
And I think that's very important. I think, it's not that the US or the European Union can create peace where there's no desire for peace. I think that's a real challenge. What worked in Northern Ireland in the 1990s was that combination of grassroots activism, community support. The Irish-British governments playing that part. Yeah. The Northern Ireland parties, without them, there would be no peace process. It just wouldn't have got going at all. So, the US role was working in a situation which was, heading in the right direction. It was an essential piece of it, and, it was an essential contribution, but on its own would not have been enough. It wouldn't have been enough in the 1970s or 1980s when that desire and strong, impulse for peace wasn't there.
In my human rights class, we've been talking about responsibility to protect, the R2P doctrine, which, again, imperfect as it is some attempt to define when and where and how and by whom intervention can take place. And again, so many of these doctrines, principles, even agreements are insufficient, but at least these are steps forward to try to sort out what is the responsibility globally of, and I'm sure this is a constant discussion at the UN about, again, who, where, what, why, and how the humanitarian intervention even can take place. And so I'm wondering about other initiatives that, I think if we turn a bit to the UN, and I think Serena you may have a question about that as well. So maybe make your way to the mic. Sorry, I'm summoning my students from it, but they're all very passionately interested in these topics now. But also, I think Ireland as a small state does very clearly punch above its weight in terms of international influence. Maybe that's partially because of scale and size, but also a function of history and many of the other things that in a kind of communitarian sensibility and ethos as well. But wanted to see what you were wondering about, Serena.
So, hi, I'm Serena Sajwan. I'm actually a business major, and you might be wondering why is a business major doing here. But it's like you said, Ambassador, you really need experience and engagement. I actually got involved with Paths to Peace just to get the experience and involvement and exposure, because, if you don't really have the exposure, you don't really know what's going on in the world. You only know what you're exposed to. So I have a general question in regards to, opposing sides. especially during this time, there are like many opposing sides, contradicting sides, and opinions that need to be addressed. And from your experience, what advice do you have for young diplomats and diplomats in general that are aspiring to be, when it comes to addressing and compromising, what stance and what advice do you have for them? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Serena. And there's no contradiction. We often meet business groups coming from Ireland, and I often say the skills that make a successful diplomat are skills that make a successful business person. It's building relationships, it's trust, it's not cutting corners, it's not cheating people, it's just always building a relationship that just sustains businesses long term. So I don't think it's unusual at all. I think there's a real crossover. I think that's it. I think firstly, being absolutely respectful of different positions. I know that's hard in the world of social media. You look at Twitter or X, whatever it's called, and it's so
Hateful.
it's terrible, it's just one side. I mean, I saw in Ireland, on the 7th of October, that awful day when Hamas did, all those atrocities. And I saw people in Ireland, putting an Israeli flag and then putting a Palestinian flag, choosing a side. And I've tried to see them over the last month, addressing issues, and they're stuck in their same sides. It's all Israel or all Palestine, and no meeting of minds. And that's the antithesis of good diplomacy, where it should be, you have to understand everyone's position. You have to understand where everybody is coming from, different countries, different communities. In Northern Ireland, there was, you're trying to build relationships across the board, across the community, understand perspectives. It doesn't mean you walk away from your national position or your own deeply held beliefs, but it's accepting difference and accepting understanding and listening, being respectful, and understanding that ultimately in any negotiation, whether it's business negotiation or whether it's peace negotiation, everybody has to walk away with something. If there's winners and losers, that will not last. If there's winners and losers, you're going to be back, in conflict, your deal is going to break down, and you're going to be back where you are a year later or 2 years later in an even worse position because trust has been broken. So everybody has to walk away with something. And the Good Friday Agreement, like all really good peace agreements, I think like all deals, to be honest, they have something for everyone, and everybody can see that spirit of compromise. Sometimes you may have to use what we used in Northern Ireland, which is this concept of constructive ambiguity, particularly in the early stages, just being delicate with language, maybe not saying everything that out, in hard, rigid ways, because everybody, you look at the Northern Ireland conflict, Sinn Féin had to go back to their base, the Unionist Party had to go back to their base, and to build an agreement there, both leaderships needed a certain ambiguity around certain elements of the agreement. I'm not talking lies, but I'm talking ambiguity. Colm Tobin, who's an Irish writer, some of you may know, he spoke to us once and he said he delighted in our use of slippery words. Slippery words that just help you get through difficult moments. And he meant it as a compliment. So respect, understanding, the absolute understanding that you have to ensure everyone walks away with something, that there are no 100% winners, 100% losers. That's a recipe for disaster. And then finding the words and the ways through really difficult, intractable problems. That's easier said than done, but it's there. It can be found. It really is at variance with our modern politics and with our modern social media, where everything is immediate. There's no reflection. Everything is a victory. Everything is a defeat. I'm right, you're wrong. And, Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern have spoken about their genuine fear that had we had social media in 97, 98, we would not have got the Good Friday Agreement, that everything would have been leaked immediately, and once any proposal is put out in the public, it's then torn down. It's defeat, it's compromise, it's a dirty word, it's all of that. So that can be, it's a much more difficult negotiating environment now, where there's 24/7 news cycle, there's instant exposure, instant spin, misinformation, disinformation. It's much more challenging. But those those skills we all use to such good effect in Northern Ireland, I think still hold strong. Mutual respect, mutual understanding, listening, and finding a way through that involves compromise, even though compromise is now presented as a dirty word.
Yeah, it's so much of it is not demonizing the other too, and othering, and also really listening, as you said, to the narrative of the other. What's the story historically, and what's the context, and what are the feelings of the other, and to find some kind of compromise. What's distressing, I'm sure, for all of us is how far we seem to be from that here in the U.S. right now, again, where there's this polarization, this division, and, as I said before, the kind of demonizing of the other, and the win-lose. You're winners or you're losers. And, of course, it doesn't work that way ultimately.
I'm not going to comment on U.S. politics.
Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
But I think it's a trend. It's not just in the U.S. We're seeing it. We're seeing it in Europe. We're seeing it. We're starting to see the first signs of it in Ireland, which is quite a consensual politics. It is a real concern. I mentioned, Tip O'Neill and President Reagan working together on issues. I had lunch a year ago with Senator Pat Leahy, who is a now retired senator, great guy, Irish-American friend of ours, and he was actually instrumental in getting support for the International Fund for Ireland. But he did reflect quietly and sadly on the spirit in the Senate years ago when he was a young senator, that people would have their very robust debates on the floor of the Senate, would disagree, would then find ways through to deliver for people, and would then go for maybe a Scotch on a Thursday evening, or an Irish or a bourbon, and just have that relationship that wasn't denying the strength of their political convictions, but was just showing a certain respect and a relationship. And he was sad at what he sees as the demise of that kind of politics. But it's not just I mean, we're seeing that trend elsewhere. I think it is driven in many ways by social media and by that sense of win-lose politics. But it's very hard to build peace processes, and it's very hard to deliver for everyone if that politics of compromise is absent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was that diplomatic enough?
Yeah, it was extremely diplomatic, but also helpful and instructive in terms of what we need to learn here as well, as we see this kind of spiraling out of control, this kind of polarization and division that is so very destructive. Genevieve, did you have a question? Genevieve also went on the program last year and was a wonderful, and also then went back again to Ireland and has Irish roots. So triple threat.
Yeah. So Ireland is known for its culture and traditions and language, and has become very diverse and progressive, and culturally also progressive compared to other countries. So what factors have helped Ireland become so progressive, and how do you protect the Irish language and culture while also embracing other cultures and languages?
They're really, really excellent questions. I think, first of all, I think it's important to contextualise Ireland. Ireland, 26 counties of Ireland gained its independence in 1922. The first thing we did was join the League of Nations in 1923, because we realised as a small country, bobbing about in the Atlantic, we needed a world based on rules and relationships and partnership, not on might is right, not on empires. So, our policy foreign policy will always be defined by the peaceful resolution of conflicts, by human rights, by humanitarian aid, by development. So all of those kind of issues make us very comfortable in the UN, and they're very representative of the Irish people. I mean, our aid programme has never come under political attack or partisan political attack. Our role at the UN has never been a divisive issue in Irish politics. It's been very, very strong support politically in our parliament, but outside as well. Ireland had a difficult path, to be honest. Particularly in the role of women, and I speak as someone who grew up in a more modern Ireland, but we got things really badly wrong in our first few decades when it came to the role of women in public life and the role of women generally. And the role, the world that my daughters have been born into, the Ireland my daughters have been born into, is a world away from the world that my mother was born into in 1932 in Midland Ireland. I mean, the opportunities, but also the judgment, the stigma, all the rest of it, hugely, hugely different. We got it badly wrong. In our independence struggle, the first woman elected to the Westminster Parliament was Countess Markievicz, who took her seat in Dáil Éireann in the Revolutionary Parliament. She was minister on her first day, Minister for Labour. We didn't have a woman minister after that until 1979. So all the great involvement in the cultural and political revolutionary period for women, the role of women, they were pushed back into the kitchen for 50 years. And they only emerged, and we only got that right through activism, through women demanding better, demanding access to contraception in the 70s, demanding access to education, demanding equal access on juries, demanding their own bank accounts, not their husband's bank account. Like, so many things we got wrong. Now, we weren't alone in that, but we got so much wrong. We got so much wrong, in the private lives of people, in the bedroom. When I was growing up, homosexuality was illegal. It's hard to believe. It's incredible. Access to contraceptives was a very slow process. So on those social issues, we got things really badly wrong. But activism, change, people getting involved in politics really shifted the dial. People getting involved in journalism. But a long journey. And in 2015, we were the first country to have a popular referendum to legalise same-sex marriage. A year later, we had a referendum to end the outright ban on abortion in our constitution. And I'm not saying that they were extraordinary moments, but they were extraordinary moments, not because of the decisions, which you can agree with or disagree with. It was the really inclusive debates we had that meant that those issues, which were hugely divisive in Ireland when I was growing up, they were passed by 69, 70, really huge figures across all Ireland, rural and urban, across all ages. And for us, it was the progressive nature of the debate and the respectful tone of the debate that was really that we drew real inspiration from. And it was the role of parents whose sons and daughters were gay. It was the voices of women who had gone to England to have abortions and coming on Irish radio and saying that was wrong. Having to make that journey without support, without friendship, without anything. Those voices and the tenor of debate was really important. And we also had citizens' assemblies, so we kind of took it out of the parliamentary divisive political space and brought it into the wider public space. Really, really important. So I think that's been important. I think the access to education over 50 years, free education, really, really important. And this comes back to your point about Irish people, we're a small island. Yes, generations have emigrated for economic reasons, but so many young people are travel abroad for life experience, for not just for careers, for jobs, but also just to have a bit of adventure. And so many came back with that just wider perspective of the world, coming back from America with a real entrepreneurial spirit, which drove our economic growth, but also coming from all over the world, Africa, Asia, wherever you are, you're going to see Irish people. And bringing back those different perspectives really helps. So I think it's been a journey from a very painful past to a better present. What really resonates, I find, in the UN with many, many diplomats from across the world where these are very live issues, these social and economic issues, is the interest in how we built, political support in a inclusive, respectful way is the important learning for us. On the Irish language, I'm a huge, I speak it, I learn it, a great belief in multilingualism. Not just living in a world where everyone speaks the one language. You know, it's or just reads Anglophone papers, or just lives in an Anglophone bubble. You know, when you're speaking a different language, you are connecting with a different part of your soul, your spirit, your intellect. Ireland has struggled to keep our language. You know, we look at historical reasons why the language is now only spoken as a first tongue by people in the West Coast, in Donegal, etc. The famine was a cataclysm for our language. Absolutely, you look at maps of where Irish is spoken across the island, but you know, 1 million died, 1 million fled, and came to these shores. And it started a process of emigration, particularly in rural areas, that really has only halted in the last 20 years, devastating for the language. And then you're trying to maintain and develop, you know, a language in an Anglophone world, particularly, you know, with modern technology, communications, TV, radio, internet, where English is the lingua franca. And I've nothing against English, by the way. I think we write English pretty well in Ireland, but it's that sense of saving something that's really, really special and important to us. It's not easy. It's not easy for many countries to hold on to their linguistic diversity, but it is very important. And it's really interesting here to come here and see Native American communities striving to maintain their language and their traditions, and I think that's really, really important. And I think the world is richer for such diversity. A world that just speaks one language, I think, would lose so much. Whether that's Spanish or English or French, there's strength in diversity. There's strength in deep cultural roots and threads that are worth preserving and bringing forward. So that's a very long-winded answer to why we feel, you know, protecting and encouraging the Irish language is really important. And, you know, we feel it flows in its own sake. It's important, but also flows into our use of English. It flows into our cultural engagement with the world, and it also, I think, flows into our politics of engagement with communities that are under pressure across the world, either culturally or politically. And we've as a country we are very strongly supportive of the two-state solution, Palestine and Israel, and the peace process there. We're very strongly supportive of the East Timor struggle for liberation, for the anti-apartheid struggle in Africa, many years South Africa. So there's a connection between our own historical experience, our own cultural experience, and how we view the world today. And I think that's not a bad thing. So
it's a wonderful thing. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because we were just speaking in my class about how, in the U.S., Native Americans, indigenous peoples were forbidden to speak their native languages, just as fortunately long ago, but the Irish were forbidden to speak their language by the British. So the struggle to try to maintain and preserve and evolve those wonderful cultural treasures is widespread in the world.
It is, and it's important. I was, and it wasn't, it was pretty much the tool of many empires. I mean, I was in a Croatian island 2 years ago, and I saw this little plaque outside a building. It was a little island in Croatia, beautiful place, and it was commemorating the first Croatian language primary school that was established in 1799 when I think Napoleon was there. But that school was then abolished when the Austro-Hungarians came back, and it took another 100 years for that linguistic revival to happen. So if you keep your eyes open, it's extraordinary. You see, wherever you go in the world, you see that impulse to ban, to eradicate, to erase, and just why it's so important that that communities took hold of their linguistic and cultural heritage. And the Irish independence movement was driven by the cultural movement. After the famine, we were really in a very, very bad place, and it was many people involved in the cultural renaissance, linguistic renaissance, music, games, etc., that then drove the political, and found a voice and a respect and a kind of a self-respect again for people that was really quite in a very, very bad place. Absolutely. And that was driven as well and supported by Irish America very, very much. So keep coming back to this transatlantic connection that's so deep.
so deep and so important. And again, if people don't have language, they don't have voice. So in some ways, it's sort of the central human ability. And again, and it's such a gorgeous language too. I think, isn't Irish the longest still spoken language in the world today, or still widely used?
I don't think that. I know it goes back. It certainly it has the oldest written tradition in European languages, going back to 500, 600 AD. I'm not sure. I think the languages in Australia
of this
Aboriginal would be and indeed Native American tribes here. It's not a competition.
Yes. No.
It's a beautiful and ancient language that's trying to hang on in a world that it's quite hard to do.
Yes. Yeah. Wonderful. Nick, did you have a question you'd like to share? And a special thanks goes out to Nick, who designed the poster and did so much additional work too. Yes.
Well, I appreciate it, but I wanted to thank the ambassador for coming again today. I know this has just been a wonderful panel to listen to. I've learned so much more. So, as a student, I've spent a lot of time observing the world, listening to other young people's opinions, and also following the role of the United Nations, too. It comes up a lot in conversation. And, I think the UN fills a gap we have in this world of organizations that take on the duty of promoting international peace. It's something that's really important. But I know also that in the past, and especially in present times, a lot of us young people can feel really disillusioned with the status of our world, and one that feels really even more so divided than in the past. I know you also during the panel talked about the process of healing and how really painful that can be, and regaining confidence in our institutions can be a really important part of healing. So first, in these times, for people who might not really feel confident anymore in what the role of the United Nations might be, what would you say to them? And what do you think as young people we should really discuss to understand how we can feel confident in our own institutions?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think the UN, I just said, it fills a gap. Why is the UN as it is? I mentioned the League of Nations. The League of Nations utterly failed. It failed because there was no US involvement for various reasons, but also failed because it had no executive power. It couldn't actually implement its decisions. So when President Roosevelt and Truman and the other kind of victorious leaders of the Second World War were designing a new global institution, they designed the Security Council to be the executive arm of the UN. And the price of that was veto powers, for the permanent 5 members, for the Soviet Union, for the US, UK, France, and China. And I fully get that, to be honest. The president wouldn't have got it through Congress without that veto. He wouldn't have got Soviet Union support without that veto. And it was the price of a successful and robust UN negotiation and agreement. So, it's a problem now, and it's a problem when an aggressor, as in the Russian Federation, has that veto, which means they can stymie any action on Ukraine. It's also a problem, to be honest, that the Security Council has struggled to say anything as a council on what's happening in Israel and Palestine today. So on the 2 big major global conflicts of our day, the Security Council has not said anything and has not issued any resolution on action. So that's a real problem, and it comes back to your concern around fate in institutions. But it's not all negative. That's a big thing. We'll leave it there. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But the UN is a flawed human institution that can only be as strong as its 193 member states, and can only be as strong as the 15 members on the Security Council. It is always only going to be able to do what it can do, what it's allowed to do. But that's quite a lot. The second Secretary General of the UN said that the UN was established not to bring humanity to heaven, but to prevent hell on earth. And it does that in many, many ways, and has done that through its peacekeeping operations, keeping the peace in there are thousands of UN peacekeepers, including Irish peacekeepers across the globe, keeping the peace in many parts of the world, including in Africa. Its development program is hugely important across the globe. Today, the UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency in Palestine, is the only thing that's keeping the West Bank and Gaza functioning at the moment under extreme circumstances. When it comes to global challenges like climate change, no country on its own is going to solve or tackle that problem. And that was a point that President Biden made in his speech to the UN this September. It's worth reading. It was a really strong US endorsement of the UN and multilateralism, with all its flaws, with all its setbacks, with all the frustrations that we know about. But when it comes to global issues like climate change, no one country, no matter how powerful, is going to tackle those issues. So there's a real space for the UN. There's a real space for the UN in peacekeeping and security, in development, in upholding human rights, in tackling global challenges. And these are really important, and I really believe in them, even though the UN can be very frustrating, and it can be, sometimes you think, okay, we're just arguing over words here. But it's flawed, it's imperfect, it's underfunded, and it only can proceed at the pace that its members will allow it to proceed, but it's still really important nonetheless. And for us, like for Ireland, a small country, as I say, bobbing about in the Atlantic, a world that's based on rules, on a charter, on agreement, is our security blanket. It's our security policy. Otherwise, we have a world where countries like Russia just invade and take what they want. And we know what that world looks like. We know what the world pre-UN looks like. An absolute disaster. Europe and the world was brought to its knees twice in a generation. And when you go, and I don't know if any of you have ever gone to Normandy to see the beaches and see all the young American men there in their graves, the price that countries like America paid to make sure that Nazism and fascism was defeated, and the price it paid to ensure that wouldn't happen again. And the UN is part of that. It's not the only instrument of multilateralism. It's not the only instrument of working together, but it's really, really important. And the world would be a much, much worse place without it, but it can do so much better. The Security Council is the executive arm. I mean, we sat in that, and I sat in that for a period in 2001, 2002. We mandated peacekeeping operations across the globe. We kept humanitarian corridors open between Syria and Turkey that 4 million people relied on. So there are real instances where it can make a real difference. The challenges when it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to those issues, and as I say, Russia vetoing any action to criticise or hold it accountable for what it's doing in Ukraine today is a real problem. And I think we're all genuinely disappointed that I think we're genuinely disappointed the US has veto resolutions on humanitarian resolutions into Gaza. We know work is ongoing. Very strong statements from the administration and from Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield on the need for humanitarian access. So it's a work in progress. It is imperfect. It's very challenging, but the UN is for us indispensable.
So, when Americans particularly criticize the UN, I always want to say, don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. That it's a work in progress. Without the UN, the world would be even more disastrous.
Yeah.
So we're winding down on time. I wish we could have the ambassador here for a whole semester, but I'm wondering if you wanted to share some of the insights from.
Yeah, I do want to say a few words about the Middle East because it's topical, and I'm going to be very sensitive here because I know it's an extremely sensitive topic in campuses and communities. It is in Ireland, it is here, and I know that speaking on this issue in New York, which is such a strong, vibrant Jewish community that feels very vulnerable. I'm very conscious of that, and we in the mission we have very strong relationships with the Jewish community in New York, and we sense that vulnerability even before the 7th of October. The rise of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic attacks in synagogues. So it's a really, really challenging time. And for the Irish government, we've tried to be really consistent here. And there's a lot of disinformation on social media about our position, but I think I'll set it out, and it's very, very clear. Firstly, absolute horror and abhorrence of what happened on the 7th of October. 1,400 people slaughtered by Hamas, many young people, children, over 200 hostages taken into Gaza. Absolutely horrific. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that and acknowledge the horror of what happened that day. We've also consistently called for the immediate and unconditional release of all the hostages in Gaza. Really, really important. A humanitarian and political disaster. Thirdly, and there's no buts here. I never use the word but or however. It's just consistent points. The third point is we do acknowledge Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas. We recognise every country's right to defend itself and protect its citizens. I mean that's a given, and it's a given under the Charter. We strongly believe that needs to be done in full accordance with international law and international humanitarian law. We believe those laws should hold in all circumstances. And they were negotiated and agreed by the international community after the horrors of the First and Second World War, and they were meant to apply in hard circumstances. They were meant to apply in difficult circumstances, and we strongly believe in that. We believe that states have a real duty to act in accordance with humanitarian law. We are desperately concerned about the situation in Gaza. We are desperately concerned about the plight of 2 million people, 1 million young people. The death toll, the numbers are unclear, but I think it's pretty clear that there are over 10,000 have died in Gaza over the last month. Thousands, over 4,000 children. There's a lack of access to water, fuel, energy, electricity. Hospitals are in dire situation, and we have called for at our governmental level an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. And to be honest, we're just trying to be consistent, and we feel that's our consistent position. There is a humanitarian crisis unfolding. We're desperately concerned about regional escalation, Lebanon, Syria. We're desperately concerned about the situation in the West Bank, where settlers have been attacking Palestinians and stealing their land at a furious rate over the past few weeks. So on so many levels, it's an absolute disaster. We desperately need to get aid into Gaza. We need a very strong peace process on the day after when this conflict ends. We need a peace process based on a two-state solution that involves, as your Secretary of State said today, that answers the absolutely legitimate Palestinian right to self-determination, that gives the Palestinian people hope for their aspirations and gives them an economic and political future, and that gives them security, and that provides Israel with security. And I'm going to end with a quote from Yitzhak Rabin. He was the Prime Minister who negotiated the Oslo Accords in the early 1990s as Prime Minister of Israel. An extraordinary figure, a military man who wore the uniform of Israel and defended Israel, with might. And he reached out with people like Yasser Arafat, with the encouragement of the then US administration, with the encouragement of countries like Norway, to build a peace process. And unfortunately, it's one of the great tragedies of history that he was assassinated in 1996. But he gave a lecture to the Nobel Peace Prize gathering in 1994. And he gave this paragraph, and I'm going to leave it with you. It says, "We invest huge sums in planes and tanks, in armoured plating and concrete fortifications. Yet despite it all, we fail to protect the lives of our citizens and our soldiers. Military cemeteries in every corner of the world are silent testimony to the failure of national leaders to sanctify human life. There's only one radical means of sanctifying human lives, not armoured plating or tanks or planes or concrete fortifications. The one radical solution is peace." And for me, I read that, and to be honest, I was almost in tears reading it. It shows that, here were two peace processes in the 1990s, Northern Ireland and Oslo, the Middle East. We drew inspiration from the Middle East peace process. We drew inspiration that hardened enemies could sit down around the table with international help and find a way through. And we drew inspiration from that, and we drove on. And 4 years later, John Hume was giving a similar speech at the Nobel Peace Prize Awards. We were lucky. The essential, the important leaders survived in the Northern Ireland peace process. The important leaders reached compromise. The important leaders of their communities found a way through and kept on coming back. It wasn't easy. They didn't like each other, and they didn't like the compromises. They were difficult, but with support. And I have to talk, really compliment Tony Blair, our own Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, people like Senator George Mitchell, people like President Clinton, and on into the Bush administration, and on into the Obama administration, and on into the current administration. Constant support for the Northern Ireland peace process. That's what's required. And unfortunately, the Middle East and Israel, the people of Palestine, haven't had that radical solution. It's desperate. And what we're seeing today is desperate. And it's when peace processes run out of steam, or are neglected, or are not looked after, and not tended and cared for like a very delicate plant. And it's a real... I'm not saying the two situations are equal in terms of scale or in terms of complexity or history. No one peace process or no one conflict is the same. But peace processes need really careful attention and careful nurturing. And when it goes wrong, it can go really badly wrong. And I just, one piece of advice today is to go and look on the Nobel Peace Prize website. Look at John Hume's speech from 1998. Look at Yitzhak Rabin's speech from 1994. They're well worth reading. And I think what they do is just they drive us on. They drive us on, and we've had dark days, and I've had dark days in my career on the peace process in Northern Ireland when it looked really, really heading to a dark place. And we always spoke about our duty of hope to keep going. It sounds kumbaya, but it's not. You have to have hope to drive on, and you have to work with people who can find hope. And today, our Prime Minister is speaking in Paris at the Gaza Humanitarian Ceasefire Conference, or humanitarian conference, and he made that very point that even in its darkest days, and it can be really hard to see a way through here, politics and dialogue and diplomacy and compromise are the only way forward. They're the radical solution, not tanks or walls or fortifications. That just, that's not where you find real peace and a sustainable solution.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you. What a great way to end. Thank you so much. Julian, did you?
Yeah, I guess sort of a question going back to the Good Friday Agreement.
Or actually, I was just thinking, because I think of the time.
Yeah.
So just to thank you.
Yeah, just really quickly. Yeah, so
Sorry.
do you
I
think
think we're meeting some off later on.
We are.
Continue
we
the
are,
conversation.
So I want to thank you for coming, and I actually have a gift on behalf of Hofstra University.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. But my question is, so going back to the Good Friday Agreement, do you think that there are any groups of people that, if you were to do it again today, that you would want to include in a similar manner as the Women's Coalition, whether that's immigrants, youth, or the elderly?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think youth voices were pretty absent, and I think that's one constituency that I think we should have tried to brought more into it, in a sense, not just trying to end the conflict, but to look to the future in a really meaningful way. I would bring, newer communities in now. Northern Ireland in 1998 was not a diverse community. There weren't many immigrants communities there in a way that there are now. I think the one constituency that was really not looked after was the victims community, those who lost loved ones. I think we did get a reference in at the end, but we didn't look after that, and that's the issue we're still grappling with today. The legacy of the past, justice versus peace. Those really difficult issues that peace processes grapple with. What does justice look like? What does peace look like? What are those compromises to get there? But I think they weren't as hardwired into the process in 96, 98 as they should have been, and I think that's one area really. So I think young people definitely, and then those who lost loved ones in the conflict.
Okay, thank you.
Great. We can talk more about that informally too. But again, we're so grateful for your for your wisdom, your inspiration, your speaking truth, and hopefully, particularly for young people, this radical nature of peace is something that we can take away and implement in our lives. So, again, thank you so much. Another thank you.